Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So today we take our next step in our source work. So we've been spending the last few weeks learning some basic skills that we need anytime we're working with outside sources. So we've talked about summarizing, we've talked about paraphrasing, and directly quoting. So hopefully we're comfortable with all of those skills by now. So today, this week, we're going to sort of make the next move, take the next step when it comes to working with our sources, and that means working with multiple sources at the same time. That's our next sort of logical move. Up until now, you guys have been working with just one source at a time for the most part, at least since the annotated bibliography. So since then, you picked one source to summarize, and then last week I told you guys to pick one source to use for paraphrasing and quoting practice. So fine, that's all good. But in the future, once we actually get moving on our research papers, you're going to find that you're not always going to be able to discuss one source at a time. Sometimes, yeah, in certain body paragraphs that you write in the research paper, you might just be talking about one of your outside sources. You might be paraphrasing it, quoting it, and that's the only source that appears in that particular paragraph, and that's fine. But there's going to be other paragraphs, maybe a lot of other paragraphs, where you're talking about more than one source. And in many cases, we want to be able to talk about multiple sources, not only in the same paragraph, but maybe in the same sentence. We're going to have similarities and differences between sources that we can use to talk about those sources, to talk about how they're working together or how they might represent two different viewpoints. There's a lot of options, as we're going to see, but we need to get comfortable with talking about multiple sources together at once, at the same time. We can't just go 1 through 8 because eventually we're going to have 8. We can't just go through them one at a time in our papers. We don't really have the space for that. We're not going to be able to say, okay, here's my first source, and then a little later on, here's my second. Now I'll talk about my third. A little later, get to my fourth. We don't really have the time or the space to move in such a leisurely fashion. So at times, you're going to have to talk about your second, third, and fourth source all together. Maybe in the same body, maybe over the course of a couple of bodies, maybe in even a shorter passage of text. But you will have to do this kind of work if you are successfully handling your sources on the research paper. So we need to start practicing now. The two big concepts for us beginning this week and continuing into the week after spring break will be analysis and synthesis. Okay, so our next big assignment is the rhetorical analysis. So obviously, analysis is a big part of it. It's in the title. So we need to talk more about the concept. But I'm assuming a lot of you already know what analysis is. You've probably written some kind of analysis in a previous English class. If you took my 101, you had to write a process analysis. If you took a different instructor for 101, you might have done something slightly different. But most 101 classes incorporate some type of analysis essay, whether you're analyzing a process or a particular genre of like literature or whatever. There's usually some kind of analysis built in. So we should have some experience with this type of writing, but we'll talk about it more here today. And then the other concept that's very important for us starting now is synthesis. So let's start with analysis and then we'll move to synthesis. So analysis is just breaking something down into its individual parts in order to better understand that thing. So we can really analyze anything under the sun. As I tell my 101 students, we can analyze works of literature, we can analyze TV shows, we can analyze car engines, we can analyze recipes, we can analyze almost anything, and the basic process will stay the same. No matter what our subject is, we're breaking it down literally. The word means to undo, to take something apart. Now, in the case of like mechanical objects, we literally are doing that. We can take things apart and look at all the individual parts or elements that go into that thing. And by sort of exploring all of those elements and parts, by looking at the relationships between them, we are better able to understand the entire subject that we are analyzing. So that is what we are doing. That's what we're going to start doing with our sources. We're going to be taking them apart. We're going to be looking at individual parts and elements, individual types of evidence, specific claims, individual ideas and points and statements that we can find in that source. And we're going to be looking at all of those. We're going to be exploring the relationships between some of those individual parts, and that will help us to better understand the entire source. To some extent, we've already been doing this, at least a little bit. We've already been looking for important ideas, big claims, important examples of evidence. We've already been doing some of that with our summaries and with some of the other work that we've been doing over the last few weeks. So this shouldn't be brand new to us, but we're going a little bit more in depth now. And the goal of analysis, the ultimate goal, is always to arrive at a greater understanding of the thing that we are analyzing. But it's not just for you. I mean, obviously, you want to have a great understanding of each and every one of your sources. But more importantly, you're going to need to help your readers to understand some of these sources. You're going to need your readers to understand what your sources are doing, what your sources are saying, and why it all matters. So we're going to be doing a lot of analysis over the next few weeks. We're also going to be synthesizing. And a lot of you probably know what that word means. To synthesize means to combine. We will be combining multiple ideas, multiple viewpoints, and yes, multiple sources. And then we're going to be reassembling them and sort of creating a new thing, a new theory, or a new system of our own devising. So by analyzing all of these sources, we're going to have a greater understanding of them, and then we're going to be combining them. We're going to be bringing multiple sources together based on similarities and differences, based on evidence, based on the big ideas and big claims in those sources that we've already identified and analyzed. We're going to be bringing them together so we can talk about multiple sources at the same time, in the same place, on our research paper. So we're going to be practicing these basic skills over the next couple of weeks. And I'm going to give you guys a really simple procedure that you can use to help you get ready for the rhetorical analysis. So like most things that we've done so far in this class, I like to give you guys a step-by-step process or a sort of established procedure that you can practice, hopefully memorize, and kind of master, so you can keep using it throughout the semester. So we have a simple 4-step process for analyzing and synthesizing our sources. So once we get moving on the rhetorical analysis after spring break, what I'm going to want you guys to do is to choose 2 or 3 of your own sources. Okay, sources that you've already found. It's great if they appear on the first half of your annotated bib. But if they don't, that's no big deal. Maybe you have found them more recently. You found them since you turned in the bibliography. That's fine. Maybe you found them yesterday. Maybe you find them over spring break. It doesn't matter. As long as these are sources that you are planning to use later. Okay, if you're not planning to use them for your research paper, you really don't need to be wasting any time on them. Okay, these need to be sources that you are working with later. But it doesn't matter if I've already seen them or not. As long as you feel good about them, as long as they are proving helpful and useful to you. So you choose 2 at minimum, 3 at max. All right, 2 or 3. Only 2 options here. So choose 2 or choose 3. As a general rule of thumb, if you're working with several short articles, 3 would be a pretty good number. If the articles are a little bit longer, you might want to stick with just 2. All right, but 2 or 3. And then we need to start our procedure, our process. So step 1 should be very familiar to us by now because we've been doing it all semester. You obviously need to read each one of your sources. If you haven't already, you need to practice all of our critical reading skills that we were talking about back in week 1. You need to annotate, you need to underline, and you need to ask some questions. Again, annotating and underlining are just so important because they start things in the right direction. They get the ball rolling. They're going to help you write your summary. They're going to help you with your future analysis and synthesis. You got to get some notes down as you're reading. So you know what you're looking for. You need to go ahead and identify some of those big ideas, some of those really important claims. Like I've said, you should have underlined some of those. You should have highlighted some of those. You should have written some notes in the margins about some of those big ideas as you're reading. So use your annotations and the stuff that you underline to complete the later steps. But obviously read and annotate everything. Step 2, go ahead and write some brief summaries. So once you're finished with each one of your sources that you're going to use for the upcoming assignment, go ahead and write a brief, kind of informal summary of that particular source. You're not going to have to turn these summaries into me, but use the same basic procedure that we were using a couple of weeks ago. Sort of introduce the source. And again, that's for your benefit because as you work with more and more sources, it's going to get difficult sometimes to keep them straight. So you need to identify the source based on the author's name and the title. Okay, because when you're dealing with a whole bunch of sources, you don't want to get names or titles mixed up and confused, and I see that every semester. So just follow that same 3-step process that we were using 2 weeks ago. Introduce the source, cover the main ideas, the biggest claims, and then drive home the thesis of that source, the overall argument, the overall point or purpose of that source in your own words. So you can keep these summaries brief. They don't have to be as long as the big summary that you turned in back in whenever that was, week 6. Okay, these can be relatively brief. They can even be in bullet points. You don't necessarily have to write incomplete sentences, though I kind of recommend that you do, because if you write pretty good, pretty polished summaries, you might be able to pull complete sentences out of that summary, out of one of those summaries, and use some of those sentences later on. But you can be quick, you can be informal with your summary, you can do it kind of in note form. Remember with our summaries before we actually started writing them, we kind of got our notes and we organized them in some kind of numerical order. We created a list, we assigned numbers or letters to all of our big notes, our big annotations, the stuff that we wrote down as we read, and then we used that numbered list to help us get started actually writing our summary. But since you're not turning these summaries in, you can just stick with that numbered list. You can just have bullet points or some kind of sequential list of the really big ideas that you would want to include in a summary. So once you have that, And again, you might have complete sentences, you might just have fragments, bullet points, whatever, but you're at least identifying the most important stuff in each one of the sources that you're going to use. So once you have your summaries, you can move on to step 3. And the third step is creating a chart. I really like the chart here, and I want you guys to actually make them, either make a chart of your own, either by hand or you can do it in a Word doc. So this is just a way to get organized. So I want you to create a 3-column chart. All right, the first column will be similarities. You need to label them. So the first column is similarities. The second column will be differences. And the third column will be overall arguments or overall points, some kind of big picture type of heading. So once you have the 3-column chart, you need to start filling them with either stuff that you've already written down or new sentences of your own. But really, the way this is supposed to work is you're supposed to be able to grab stuff from the summaries that you just wrote for part 2, and now you're starting to put some of those sentences or even just fragments, whatever, you're starting to put those into your chart. And obviously, follow the different columns. So look for similarities between the sources. And you might want to write a brand new sentence or a handful of sentences that kind of incorporates some of the similarities that you've noticed. Or what some students do is let's say you have 3 sources. So you have 3 summaries. And you find a note or a bullet point or a sentence in each one of those summaries that's kind of similar, making a similar point or at least sort of in the same ballpark. So you could go ahead and try to write a synthesis sentence where you're covering all 3 of those things from your summaries in one bigger, more polished sentence. And you can put that new sentence in the chart. Or what other students do is they just cut and paste those 3 individual pieces from their summaries, and they put each one into the similarities column. Okay, here's what source A is saying, here's what source B is saying, and here's what source C is saying, and as we can tell, there's a lot of similarities in there. So either way, just try to get some of those similarities that you're noticing between your sources, get those into the first column. And then do the same thing for the second column, only now you're searching for differences. So this can be easy sometimes if you have 2 sources that are on opposite sides of a debate. If they are representing opposite positions, opposite viewpoints, of this particular debate that you're a part of, or just they're taking 2 different sides about your topic, then it can be very easy then to find obvious differences between those 2 sources. So go back through the 2 or 3 summaries that you've written and look for ways that these sources are different. Different ideas, different viewpoints, different perspectives. You can even notice differences in how they're using evidence. And I really want you guys to dig into the evidence that you're seeing in your sources. So you might notice that one of your sources is really leaning heavily on artistic appeals, a lot of pathos, making us feel a lot of emotions, really leaning on the goodwill component of ethos, really sticking with the artistic appeals, whereas other sources, especially sources from academic journals, those peer-reviewed scholarly sources, they're going to lean more heavily on inartistic appeals. There's going to be a lot of numerical evidence. There's going to be testimonials, and we're comfortable with testimonials because we've been quoting a bit ourselves. So we're going to see that a lot of our sources are utilizing other people's words, maybe expert opinions, maybe eyewitness accounts, whatever. We might find graphical evidence. So notice that different sources will be using different kinds of evidence, perhaps to different, with different levels of effectiveness. Okay, so that can be a difference that you notice. Or the difference can be even more obvious. Like this source thinks that the topic is bad, and this other source says that the topic is good. So whether they're obvious differences or a little more subtle, like, hey, these two articles are making very similar arguments, but they're using different types of evidence to support those arguments. That's a cool difference to track. But do the same thing for the second column that you did for the first column. You can cut and paste stuff directly from your summaries, or you can write brand new sentences that incorporate multiple things that you have in those summaries. Whatever you want. But try to fill in the first two columns based on the work that you've already done. Again, every step here builds on the previous step. So once you have good summaries, you are ready to fill in your columns. And that third column is the overall argument, the overall purpose. And again, that stuff should already be in your summaries. You should already have those written in your own words. So if you already have the thesis of your sources in your summaries, just cut and paste them or retype them into that third column so you can clearly see the overall argument of each source. And again, they might be very, very similar. That might be another similarity that you can explore. Or if the thesis statements or the overall arguments are very different, that's obviously a difference that you can explore. But the overall arguments are so important, they get their own column. Okay? You can later treat them like another similarity or another difference, but when creating your chart, give the arguments their own column. That's the third column. Okay, so again, there's a lot of different stuff that you can put in there. You're obviously focused on the big ideas and the big claims from your summary. So in other words, what are these sources saying? A lot of that needs to be in the chart. Also, evidence, specific types of evidence need to be in the chart, whether they're under similarities or differences. And another thing that you can start doing now is providing some evaluation and some viewpoints of your own. Okay, so I told you with summaries and paraphrases that there's really no room for your own opinions, your own ideas, your own views. But in an analysis, we can be a little bit more subjective. So as you're tracking similarities and differences, you can start weighing in on effectiveness. You can start evaluating a little bit more, kind of like we did on the annotated bibliography, but now we're doing more of that. We're kind of pushing that further. So again, if you find the inartistic appeals in source B to be a more effective form of evidence than the artistic appeals that you see in source A, you can say that. Like, you can put that opinion somewhere, maybe in your chart, maybe right next to your chart, under your chart. You might want to have a separate section just for evaluation, but you can also start to put some of those evaluations into the chart. Because we can share opinions now. That is allowed for the future work that we're going to be doing. So once you have those charts, you're ready to move on to the fourth and final step, which is all about writing some new sentences and maybe some new paragraphs as well. So now you need to look at your columns, look at everything that's in the columns, and see if you can start to make some generalizations, some large, sort of generalized statements. And some of those statements will later find their way into your rhetorical analysis essay. So just to give you a few examples of the types of sentences that you can be writing for this stage, for this step. All three of my sources seem to claim blank. If you find a common claim, a similar claim in all three, then you can write a simple sentence like that. You can also identify these sources by author names and titles. I'm just using source A, source B, source C as a kind of shorthand. You might want to use author names and titles so you're keeping all of these sources straight. Or you might want to have a key for yourself where source A equals Lackey's article, source B is Johnson's book chapter, whatever, as long as you are clear. That's what matters. So other examples, while authors A and B focus on blank, author C seems to be more interested in blank. So just stuff like that, just generalized statements based on the information in your chart. And now you can start really creating new content. This is where the synthesis comes in. Now we're creating something new by combining all of these different sources. Now we are creating a new sentence or a new paragraph. And eventually we're going to be creating a whole essay based on the summaries and the analysis that we've already conducted. So the analysis really kind of comes first. Reading is first, and critical reading strategies, then summarizing, then the analysis is largely getting done just as you go, as you're reading, as you're summarizing, and as you're creating your chart. And then once you have that chart, you're ready to really start synthesizing. You're going to use the chart to help you get started on your own synthesis, putting these sources together. So then in the big essay that we turn in after spring break, you're analyzing, but that whole thing is also a synthesis. It is that new thing that you are creating by combining these sources. But as you're combining, of course, you're analyzing as well. You're sharing with your audience the analysis that you have already completed. So write as many of these new sentences as you can. And again, you might want to start picking out the specific ideas, the specific points, the specific types of evidence that you want to explore more in the essay that you're going to be writing soon in that rhetorical analysis. So just write a handful of sentences at the very least to give you a sort of overview of what you're going to be getting into. Like, okay, I'm going to tackle these handful of claims, so I'm going to write a few sentences about those. There's one really key difference that I want to explore that makes the third source different than the first two. Make sure you have a sentence written about that. If you have some specific things to say about evidence, have some sentences about those. And even if you're not writing a bunch of paragraphs yet, just by writing a handful of sentences, you know what you want to pursue in the rhetorical analysis. This can almost function like a little bit like an outline. We're going to do a more formal outline later, but this is kind of the first stage of outlining, just getting these sentences down for part 4. And again, focus on similarities and differences. There might be interesting things to say about both. And you can also write some generalized statements about the overall arguments, because obviously you want to spend some time talking about those, but that might tie into other stuff that you want to do and say. So the organization is up to you. The nature of the sentences that you're jotting down will be up to you. But again, use the chart. Use the chart to help you with step 4. You're writing the sentences based on what you see in the chart. And that's pretty much our process. So I want you guys to get comfortable with it this week, using some of the sample texts that I posted to the week 8 module. And then after we come back from the break, we're going to be using this same procedure, this same process, but we'll be choosing our own sources, because ultimately we want to write about our own sources. But just as a way to practice, I've posted 3 different texts that could potentially be sources if anybody's topic happened to be social media. So all 3 of these sources are about social media. 2 short essays. So you'll see in the week 8 module, it's called like social media essays or social media readings. I can't remember what I called it, but it's just a PDF file in the week 8 module. Open it up and you'll see 2 separate essays. They're both very short. And of course, I've just stolen all of this from a textbook. So 2 essays on social media, different issues or questions connected to social media. And then we have a video to watch called Generation Like, which is actually a bit old. All 3 of these sources are. Generation Like came out, I believe, in 2014. And the 2 essays were maybe even a little bit earlier. I think one was 2012. The other might have also been 2014. So these are a little bit dated. Just go with the flow. Don't worry too much about that. But I just want you guys to practice doing what I've just described using those 3 sources. So read the 2 essays. They're not going to take you long. Jot down a few notes and then watch the video. You might find the video pretty entertaining. You really don't need to watch the whole thing. It's a pretty long documentary. I usually, in my live classes, I usually just show the first like 15 or 16 minutes of the video because we don't usually have time to watch the whole thing. So you guys can do the same. You can just watch the first 15 minutes, jot down some notes. It's really important to still annotate even when you're watching videos. I know you can't underline, but you can still jot stuff down. You can jot down observations, comments, explanations, and you have the power to pause the video at any time and even to rewind it. So if you hear something that you would have underlined if you were reading it, some big idea, some really important claim, you hear it, you might want to write it down, even rewind to make sure that you're getting it down accurately, because that might be something that will later appear in your chart, and you might want to do something with it when you're writing your own sentences later. So you don't have to write a whole essay about these 3 sources. I just want you to follow those 4 steps that I just gave you. Read or watch all 3, annotate, then write brief summaries for each one of the sources, then create your chart, that 3-column chart, and then write a handful of new sentences, synthesizing sentences, where you're talking about 2 of those sources together, or maybe all 3 of those sources together. Again, you're going to see some obvious similarities between the 3. They're all about the same topic, but they're not all making the exact same argument. So you're going to have a lot of differences that you can pursue as well. So just follow those 4 steps, get comfortable with the procedure, and then take some time off. We're obviously going to have spring break after this week. I don't have a whole lot for you guys to do during spring break other than just continue your research. But then when we come back from the break, we're going to be doing all of this same stuff, only using our own sources. So be ready for that after the break. But before the break, spend a little bit of time practicing. And I just remembered that, we do have a research journal this week where I am going to make you talk a little bit about these 3 sources. So we're not doing a full essay about the 3 sample sources, but you are going to be doing your next research journal about them. So I'm going to be able to evaluate how well you're synthesizing and analyzing. So push beyond the obvious. Remember, we're breaking these sources down to better understand how they work and what they're saying and their significance. That's the analysis part. And then we're also bringing them together combining them in various ways based on similarities and differences. That is the synthesis part. So have fun with these, and you guys should have opinions about these sources because I know you're all pretty familiar with social media, so you should have some things to say, some evaluation. You can certainly talk about the effectiveness of these sources, which one is making the best argument, which one is using evidence most effectively. You can say stuff like that. So read my instructions for the next research journal. Let me know if you have any questions. Enjoy your break, and then I will see you in week 9 after the break.